Hello and welcome to Configuring and Deploying Just Enough and Just-in-Time Administration. We've got a few stragglers, I'll let them run in. Everybody point. Everybody look. And of course, who would it be? Shame, shun, shame. It's the head-licking nemesis. Okay, welcome to Configuring and Deploying Just Enough and Just-in-Time Administration. In this session, I will give you a bit of an overview of Microsoft's sort of continuing evolution and philosophy towards systems administration, which could be sort of put down as we've met the enemy and it is us. We will talk about assuming compromise. It used to be assume breach, but the new special term is assume compromise. We will then look at and demonstrate just-in-time administration, and we will look at and demonstrate just-enough administration. So let's get into it. So a lot of security problems arise simply because we as administrators and the developers we support, or if you're a developer or if you're somewhere in between, we're so focused on getting things to just work that we spend so little or we don't have time to think about getting it to work in a secure manner. Because getting something to work in a secure manner actually means thinking about security from the outset. And when you are prototyping something, when you are conceptualizing something, when you're in that raw act of creation, that raw act of developing, that raw act of going out and just getting something out there so that people can use it to see whether or not it's worth following up further, you're not necessarily thinking, you know, this probably needs to be secure from the ground up. However, and I'm doing a session on this tomorrow where I go into 30 bad habits, which is my confessional session. It's where you can, I'm not going to say come to Jesus, but basically come to Snova or something like that, where you can admit your sins. And our sins are often that we deploy something into a development environment, and then without giving too much notice to it, it's been in production for 10 years. And this is especially true today, where you've got a lot of born-in-the-cloud organisations, where it's literally starting off as a college student or someone in their dormitory or just a couple of people hanging around thinking, I've got an idea for a business. And then suddenly they've got 100,000 users and they haven't actually gone back and architected the security. And, you know, Silicon Valley, sometimes a comedy, sometimes a documentary. A lot of IT security, and I'm sure you're aware of this, involves closing barn doors after the horse has bolted, okay? We don't hear about those stories of the brave server administrator, the brave security person who's developed such an awesome system that no one can get into it. We always hear about the poor bugger who's basically had their entire data exfiltrated and it's basically being deployed on Troy Hunt's website. To make environments secure, we need to rethink the way that we administer servers. Because historically, there has been an approach, which is that you are the sysop and that you can do everything. And this goes right back. If you actually have a look at the beginnings of the open source movement, which had Richard Stallman. One of the things that made Richard Stallman furious in the 70s was that there was these computers at the MIT lab. And he wanted to be able to do everything with them. And at some point, someone changed the code so that to do anything with them, you actually had to sort of elevate privileges. Not that way, but you had to log in with an administrator account. And he was furious because he thought that technologists should be, every technologist that used that lab should be trusted to not screw up the system. Which shows a very strange understanding of humanity, doesn't it? So, let's talk specifically about what we're seeing today. A large number of attacks, a large number of very, very, very successful attacks have involved insiders. We like to think about the person that's out there. You know, the current bugbear is an Eastern European government run by a particular person. And I'm not going to be specific because I'm travelling to that country in a couple of months because part of my family's from there. Anyway, a large number of attacks involve insiders, and we're pointing at, look at them, look at them, look at them. Okay, biggest breach of the NSA wasn't someone from outside, it was Edward Snowden. Edward Snowden was a contractor who worked for Bose Allen Hamilton. He was a systems administrator, and the security model that they had was that all of the bad people are out there, and all of the people here we kind of trust. This is a model we have to get away from in terms of trusting the people inside. There's a beautiful Scott Adams cartoon on the Dilbert future. And he said, do you really trust your colleagues? How much do you trust your colleagues? And he was talking about Star Trek. And he said, would you really trust your colleagues to ever beam you anywhere? Because these are people that can't get around to refilling the printer, or taking things out of the fridge, or stealing other people's things from the fridge. Would you trust them to beam you from here to there? I wouldn't. We have Bradley or Chelsea Manning, again, someone who worked in IT, and they were able to go and surf file shares because they had access in that internal network, and they were able to go and grab all of these interesting documents off State Department servers and burn them to CD, walk out of the building, and then eventually, allegedly, hand them to someone who I went to university with, who is now residing in an embassy in London. I did go to university with him. I only might have seen him in the corridor, but we were at Melbourne University at the same time, in the same building. But that's how those documents got out. It was an insider. It wasn't someone external penetrating the network, getting in, compromising the network, exfiltrating data. We have the Ashley Madison hack that we heard about. Now, they're almost certain that the person that perpetrated that hack actually basically took the database from inside the company and then started spewing data out. They're pretty sure that it wasn't someone externally getting access to that data. Another type of attack, we'll talk about some other types of attacks, such as attacks involving insider credentials. So in this type of attack, what you've got is you haven't got a malicious systems administrator. It's not that one of us has fallen from the path of the Jedi and become one of the Sith. It's that someone has taken our Jedi login details and then used those to get into the Jedi archive and do some nasty stuff. So the target breach. The target breach is a fantastic case study of how this sort of thing happens. There was some air conditioning supplier VPN credentials, and they were phished. So someone in Eastern Europe got access to these. Through that, they were able to get access to Target's internal network. I'm not talking about Australian Target, I'm talking about US Target. And from there, what they were able to do is they were able to go and recon the network, and they were able to find the structure of how the network worked. And what they found out was that Target had a thing in place. Each of the Target cash registers in each of the stores was running a Windows operating system. It was connected to a credit card scanner and a point of sale device. And the way that they maintained security was that they would dump or they would drop a new operating system image every day. So that way they weren't worrying about if there'd been changes made to the operating system, right? Because if you've got a clean image and you just keep dumping it on a register overnight, you're going to be fine. So what these very clever little Eastern Europeans did is that they went and infected the image that was being dropped onto the cash registers and put malware in there. So every day, the malware was redropped onto the cash registers. And not only that, they then looked at the way that the logging and the security system worked and then had that malware recognised as a Dell storage controller. So when they were looking at unrecognised software and it was coming up in the IDS, it was coming up as a Dell storage controller. Now, the next awesome bit of this hack was that when they deployed it, was a couple of days before Black Friday. Black Friday is the highest retail day in the US. So literally the people involved had the choice of we think there might be something going on with these Dell storage controllers, but we're getting it from a lot of our machines, and it's our biggest retail day. Do we turn everything off, or do we just kind of hope for the best? So that's one thing that happened with credentials. The other is a personal story. I used to work at a company called Email Metals that no longer exists. It was acquired and then split in two by two other companies. And we had a CIO. And this CIO basically came to the conclusion, because he didn't actually have an IT background. He actually had come up through the industrial side of the business. And I can say this because he's no longer with us, so it's not really defamation if they're dead, and it was like almost 15, 20 years ago. He decided that, hey, I manage the guy that manages systems administrators. So I should be a member of, and this is back in the Windows NT4 days, the equivalent of the domain admins group. Because if I can go and order a server administrator to go and do something indirectly, why can't I go and do that myself? Now, this guy was going through a divorce, and he had a kid. And this kid would come in with him. And what happened was that he would log this person in, this child, into any computer, so that on Saturday morning, the kid could go and play the equivalent of Quake or Red Alert or whatever, while the CIO was working. So what happened was that one day, the kid discovered User Manager for Domains, which was the NT4 equivalent of Active Directory users and computers. And being 13 years old, started renaming accounts with the most creative expletives he could think of. Fired administrators, another big problem, another one that you've got to think about. You'll read about this in security articles. Occasionally you will get someone who has been an administrator, who has been fired, who has been let go from the company, and then a month or two later has found out that their credentials have not been revoked, and they've gone back into the organisation and then started doing damage. And you do see, and we kid you not, in Have I Been Pwned, Troy Hunt's account database, things like admin at blah, 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 turning up in data breaches. So people are using that credential to sign up for websites such as vBulletin sites or whatever sites that are getting themselves. So the credentials are out there on the dark web. So where I'm going with this is that you could have your own credentials harvested. So when we're thinking about a security model and are thinking about a way of fixing this, what we're thinking about is, okay, how can we protect the network if we assume that our own credentials can be taken? How can we protect the network if one of our colleagues decides to go a bit rogue? It is in the NSA and the CIA's playbook that if you want to compromise a network, the easiest way to go and do it is by compromising the administrator. Because the administrator has the keys to the castle in most organisations. So if you can compromise the administrator, if you can phish them and get them to type their password in somewhere, there's a good chance, because people reuse their passwords, that you will have credentials that you could use on their network. So I want you to look at this thought experiment. How would you stop an evil mirror universe version of you, and of course, being evil mirror universe, you've got the goatee, like Spock did. Stop an evil mirror universe version of yourself from compromising the network. And I was being gender inspecific with that. Just assume that your evil mirror universe version always has a goatee, depending on whether you're male, female, or identify elsewise. How would you stop this person? Are you so brilliant that you couldn't be stopped? Is that your ultimate nemesis, yourself? Could you stop yourself? Always assume that your attacker is smarter and more competent than you, because your evil mirror universe version of you, your nemesis, might actually have a better attention span than you and not be, look, oh, I'm going to go and do this. Oh, distraction. But there's a thing to remember, and you will know this from your own life. When properly prepared, the less intelligent can block the plans and the actions of the more intelligent. Just think of how many times you have been stymied by a stupid person, and you will know this to be true. So, something else to think about. Admin accounts are often overprivileged. Now, this is because who here, when someone has offered them privileges, has said, no, I couldn't possibly take on any extra, say, administrative privileges for the SQL Server? Or you've said no? Just because you didn't want extra work? Or extra responsibility, so, oh. Okay, so you're fighting the good fight. You're losing it, though. You're losing it, yes. And that's one of the really interesting things about this sort of move to the cloud. I'm not going to say the move to the cloud. The people that are coming up, and this is a very interesting sort of discussion between old guard and new guard, is that when you've got people who are born in the cloud, when they've literally started spinning up their app and they've been able to deploy instantly on great infrastructure, because this is a big difference like between today and 20 years ago. 20 years ago, if you wanted to go and have your world-beating app, you had to do an insane amount of work to get it so that other people could use it. Today, you can spin it up in AWS or Azure, and everybody in the world can have access to it instantly, which means that a lot of these administrative role separation things aren't being thought of. Now, the other thing is, and this goes back to who here is aware of the BOFH? Has ever read The Bastard Operator from Hell? It's a set of systems administration fiction. Systems administrator revenge fiction is probably the best way to term it, where a misunderstood systems administrator takes violent revenge on users. You can find it on theregister.com. Anyway, there is an attitude out there that administrators are the only people that anybody can trust with the keys to the kingdom. That if you started handing over credentials to anybody in the organisation for administrative rights, they're going to go and break something. And if they're going to go and break something, it's probably not going to be them that's there at 5 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday fixing it. Who's the person that's going to be there at 5 o'clock in the morning on Saturday fixing it? Hands up. Yes, we've all been there. But you've got to think about it. Well, if you could come up with a way of restricting what someone could do so that they've only got that power over such a small scope of things, would it make sense to do it that way? For example, if you could set it up so that the HR department could do password resets, it'd make sense to do that. Why? Because it's really hard to socially engineer the human resources department. The human resources department, by its nature, actually cares about humans. The IT department, your mileage will vary. Someone rings up the IT department, oh, I've got this problem with my cat and I need my password reset. Cat problem, yeah, okay. Human resources might actually ask pertinent questions. Okay, what's your tax file number? What's your Medicare number? Okay, you have established your identity. We will do the password reset for you. So if you could come and scope it so that that's all they could do, that might make a better method than whatever you're using. I mean, at the moment, that's one of the reasons that people have gone with self-service password reset, is because we're sort of delegating that away from humans. Whether or not that's a good idea in the long run is another question, because usually with a self-service password reset, it's a set of very simple questions that anybody with a bit of research could actually answer. So the assume compromise model is that you design your security where you assume that attackers or people of nefarious intent are already somehow within your network. Now, it doesn't mean that they are there, but there is an old saying. There are people that know that they've been hacked, and there are people that are denying that they've been hacked, but have been hacked anyway. Now, it's not that bad, but you should design your security around this idea that attackers have already breached your perimeter network. So the current approach is to make this excellent wall on the outside of the castle. And a strong castle defence is very important. But a really, really good castle design allows the castle to be defended even if the outer wall is breached, that you have multiple layers of defence, that defence is like an onion. You design for resiliency. One proton torpedo should not be able to take out the Death Star, even if Galen Erso apparently designed it to work that way. One vulnerability should not allow everything on your network to be pwned. You need to design your network so that they are resilient, so that they fail gracefully. We know this about failover clusters. We design a failover cluster so if one node goes down, the workload keeps going because we knew that that failure might happen. So we need to think about our security in a similar way. How do we protect against that? How, if these credentials get compromised, do we minimise what someone can do? Because hopefully if we've got things set up in the right way, if something gets compromised, we can kind of find it so that they're sort of constrained to that area of the castle that they've broken through in. So just in time and just enough administration are about limiting what accounts can do and where they can do it. So let's talk specifically about just enough administration. So at its core, the idea we're talking about just-in-time administration. It's also called privileged access management. The idea with PAM, or just-in-time administration, is instead of having credentials that give you privileges until they are revoked, you have privileges for a limited amount of time. So think about it at the moment. At the moment, you'll have service desk technicians who have permission to reset passwords. And they can do that from when they arrive at 8 o'clock in the morning until they leave at 5 o'clock at night or whatever time that they're on. They have that permission, and this is what we do. Okay, you've got the ability to go and manage this server. You've always got the ability to manage this server. The idea with just-in-time administration is that you only have the power to do something for a limited amount of time, and that you need to request that right to do it. So someone who needs to reset a password goes and requests the reset a password right, and then they have the reset a password right for half an hour, or for 10 minutes, or for whatever makes sense in your organisation. But that they're not, for example, having that right, and then if they walk off and someone else sits at their workstation, they've still got the right, and that password can still be, other passwords can be go and reset. So you're limiting the scope of this, and then you're logging it very much. It's literally, Larry went and requested the reset a password right when he filled out the password right thing form, or when this was done automatically, because you can automate all of this. And that's the other good thing. It sounds like it's a horrible amount of paperwork, but think of our ability to automate things. If you've got something like Service Manager in place, you can automatically have select job type, password reset, and there'll be a button. Do you want to request the ability to reset a password? Yes. And then everything is logged in your system as to what's going on. And you might think that that is needlessly bureaucratic, but needlessly bureaucratic is something that is happening more and more because organisations are looking at the cost of breaches, and to a certain extent, technologists for a long time said, we will come up with technology to block this from happening, and the reality is it hasn't. And at a certain point in time, regulators come in and go, well, you haven't stopped this with your technological solution. So what we're going to do is we're going to put in a regulatory solution. We're going to say, and you see it with certain things like PCI DSS, where if you're going to work with payment card data, you've got to meet all of these particular requirements about how you store the payment card data. It might be that if you work in medical, dealing with medical or personal data, there might be a whole lot of rules about how you control administrative accounts that you've got to follow to be compliant. And it's not any matter then of just having good security practice, it's more a matter of meeting your compliance responsibilities. So the core technology behind just-in-time administration in the Microsoft ecosystem is Microsoft Identity Manager. So you deploy MIM. You can use anything from SQL Server 2012 SP1 onwards, from the standard edition to any version above that. SharePoint Foundation 2013 with Service Pack 1, or SharePoint 2016. Windows Server 2012 R2, or Windows Server 2016. So you delegate privileges and they only work for a limited amount of time. The way that they work is that there exists an administrative forest and a local forest. or your standard production forest. Now, in the administrative forest, things are set up using the magic of SID history so that there's shadow groups. And so when someone requests administrative privileges, their request goes across to the administrative forest. A shadow user account that's associated with their production forest user account is basically moved into a group that has a shadow version back in the production forest. So for the period of time that you configure, they're a member of that group and they can perform actions. Now, through configuring Kerberos properly, tickets only have a certain lifetime. So a person logs in, they're a member of that group until the time expires, and then in the admin forest, and then that replicates, of course, across to the production forest, they're removed from that group. So you create a group like a shadow version, so you empty domain admins. You then create a group that's got the same privileges as domain admins, you delegate that rights to it, and then you control membership of that group through Microsoft Identity Manager in another forest. So that means that even if your production forest is compromised, because all of the admin accounts live in another forest that no one ever logs onto, your admin accounts are not going to be compromised. So that someone can't go into this forest and go and steal someone's domain admin credentials because they can't get those credentials without requesting it from the other forest, and you've got a process in place to stop that. Uses multiple forest. So the idea with an ESAEA forest is that literally what you do is you allow anybody who's got an account in the production forest always has an unprivileged account. You have accounts that are members of the trusted forest and they can be added to administrative groups in the production forest. But those accounts that are in the administrative forest are also all standard user accounts. So in theory, if someone got the credentials of one of these accounts, they can't log into the production forest, into the administrative forest, and then add themselves to the domain admin groups or add other users to the domain admin groups because they're all unprivileged accounts. There's a whole lot of documentation on Microsoft's website, which I will refer you to at the end, that talks about this theory of ESAE forests. So setting it up. Privileged account creation in the accounts forest is done using several new PowerShell commandlets. These commandlets perform the following functions. It creates a new group in the accounts forest with the same security identifier as a group in the resource forest. So the account forest is your special admin forest, your resource forest is your production forest, and an object in the MIM service database that corresponds to that group. For each user account, the commandlets create two objects in the service database that corresponds to the user in each forest. And then they worry about synchronizing passwords. So from the user's perspective, they don't notice anything different. This is just sort of how the plumbing works. You then create a PAM role object in the service database. And the PAM role says, this is what the role is. This is what the privileges are. This is how long you have the role for. So you would describe it as, for example, the ability to reset passwords will last for 30 minutes. The commandlets need to be run once for each group. So you go through, and when you're setting it up, you run a bunch of different commandlets. Now, they don't change or modify any users or groups in the production forest. You would then have to do that manually, but most of the time you don't need to do that. And this is the list of commands. Now remember that all of these slides are downloadable for you, and there are actually videos on how to do this on the internet, and I'll also show you in the demonstration. But basically what's happening here is that I'm at first getting the corp forest, which is the production forest, domain admin credentials. I create a new privileged access management group called corp admins. The source domain is the production contoso.local, the source domain controller I specify. Then I create a new user called Jen. I then get Jen's password and put that in. I then create an account password, I apply that password, then I create a user in the other forest that assigns the password that I've done for one to the other. And then what happens is MIM takes over the synchronization from that point. So there is a shadow user in the other forest. Now, you can set this up so that for certain requests it happens automatically. You literally say, I want to elevate privileges, and it's like elevating privileges on a standard Windows box. Or if it's something important, such as I want the ability to add a domain controller to the domain, you can have them log onto a website and then fill out a form requesting permission to do that. And then, depending on the severity or the impact of what they're requesting, someone might need to approve it, or it might be approved automatically that you've just got a log of why it's happening. You provide your reasons, and a record is kept of all elevation requests so that you can go back and say, right, this is all of the elevation requests that happened, so that if you're doing a post-breach analysis, you know exactly what happened and when it happened, or if you're suspicious that someone is using their credentials in an incorrect manner, you have a log of it. Because if you think about your administrative logging at the moment, who here, if someone created a dodgy fake account in their domain, would actually be able to track it fairly easily? Who's here is confident of their systems enough? So probably about 5% of the room. So you can modify the properties of a secure group. Here, what it's showing is that you can change the time to live. So by default, this is saying 180 seconds. So in this one, it's only going to last for 3 minutes. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a demo and show you how this works. So here I am, it's Mel Server 1. And what I'm going to do is I am going to sign on with a user. And this is, so let's pretend we've got a user named Wayne. And Wayne's usual account is Wayne. So when Wayne wants to sign on, he signs on as Wayne, he puts in his password, and he signs on to ADatum. Okay, so what we can do is we can see what groups Wayne is a member of simply by pulling up PowerShell, by doing a whoami/groups, and I can see that these are the groups that Wayne is a member of. He's a member of the users group, he's a member of authenticated users group, but he's not a member of any admins group. And to verify that Wayne is not a local or a domain admin, what I can do is I am going to try and add a role. Now, the role I love to add in demonstrations when it doesn't mean anything is my absolutely favourite role that will never seem to get killed from Windows Server, which is, can anybody guess? Wins. It's even got win in the name. I mean, how bad a role can it be? So I click Next, I click Install, and what I get is it tries to install it, and then it tells me here, you do not have adequate user rights to make these changes. So Wayne ain't got no privileges. So what I'll do is I'll close that, and what I'll do is I'll sign off as Wayne. So the next thing I'm going to do is that there's an account in the admin forest called priv.wayne. So let's see if priv.wayne can do anything out of the box. So I log on, I specify this, and then I specify ADatum admin, which is the privileged forest, priv.wayne. And I sign in with Wayne's account. Okay, still logged onto the same server. Let's pull up a PowerShell window. Let's see what groups Wayne's a member of. Okay, so Wayne is still not a member of any administrative groups, but let's verify that by again trying to install Wins. Click Install, we wait, and then what we find is we again don't have the appropriate user rights. So what we're going to do now is we're going to use this priv.wayne account to request elevation. Now, we can do this through a web interface, but it's quicker at this point to do it using PowerShell. So what I do is I run the import module mimpam, and that basically brings in the Microsoft Identity Manager Privileged Access Management module. And then once that module is installed, I can get the PAM roles that are available for priv.wayne to request. So I can set it up and say, right, you can go and request these roles. So I go and see what roles I can request, and what I can see is that Wayne can go and request the Corp admin's role. So the Corp admin's role gives him local administrative privileges on whatever machine he is on. So I have set this up so that Wayne is able to automatically be assigned this role. So the thing is with this, at the moment I'm going to be using a lot of PowerShell in this session, but you can go and use things, you can go and use tools, and there's a whole bunch of tools that have just come out that allow you to turn any PowerShell commandlets into a nice little GUI app. So you do it that way. So when we're looking at this and when we're looking at just enough administration, you can go and create little GUI apps that basically limit someone what they can do in the GUI app, and it just basically runs PowerShell in the background. So to request the role, what we do is we write to the R variable, get PAM role for request, and if you're wondering how this is typing, I've got a Razer Tartarus gaming device, which I've programmed all of my typing into in the background, which means I don't screw up my typing in a demo. It means I can wander around while I type. It's really cool for this sort of demo. So here I've written into R, get the PAM role for request, and that'll pull the details of that PAM role, and then I'm going to go and request it. So I hit enter here. It goes out and it requests the role, and the role status will be set to processing, which means it's waiting there for it. So what I'll do while that's processing is I'll sign out because I'm going to have my group membership changed. I'll sign back in as Priv Wayne. So no, I don't want a date. Oh no, Priv Wayne, yep, that's the one. I come back here, I do my who am I /groups, and what I see here is that Wayne is now a member of Corp admins and the shadow group in the privileged forest, a Datum Corp admins. So he's been added to those groups, and to actually prove that this all works, what we can do is we can go up to add roles and features. We can click next, 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 next. We can scroll down here. We can select the Win server. We can add all necessary features. We can click next. We can click install. And the feature goes and installs. So now what we've done through that is we've requested the role from the Microsoft Identity Manager server. Wayne's shadow account in the other forest has been added to a special group that then gives him local administrative privileges on this machine. He has them for 60 minutes in this case because of the way I set it up. After those 60 minutes have expired, Wayne will not be able to use administrative privileges on this machine without requesting them again. So again, if I go down to Tools and I select Wins, lo and behold, Wins is installed on that machine. So that is how that particular technology works with just in-time administration. So let me just go and revert these VMs and then start the VMs for the next demo, and then I'll just talk through that. Has anybody at this stage got any questions about that technology? Yes, okay. Wait a sec, I'll do you and then do you. Yep. Okay, so the model that you use to do it is that you basically, and the recommendation at this stage, is that for organisations that are going to an ESAE forest model, the advantage of this is that you go and put this very clean forest in. That's where you go and put all of your admin accounts, and then you basically remove them from your current forest. So you install MIM in the special administrative forest. Okay, question was up there somewhere? Okay, so the way that that works is you're looking at Kerberos tickets. So what happens is a Kerberos ticket's got a certain lifetime to it. And when that lifetime expires, it will basically go back to the server and say, okay, can I have this ticket reissued to this person? No, because they're not a member of the group. So what happens is that because the Kerberos ticket is only valid for the lifetime of that ticket, even though they haven't logged out, so it will kind of look for a while like they're a member of that group, but when they actually try and do anything off the machine, they're not going to have the actual permissions on the network to do it. Does that answer your question? To force them to log off? Yeah, you could implement that if you were going completely that way. But one of the other ideas is that perhaps you would want them, if they run out of permissions, to be able to then request permissions without logging off, logging back on and so forth. But in a really high security environment, sure, you could do that. You could actually force them to log off if you wanted to do that. Okay, has anybody else got any questions about that? Well, that's the thing. MIM's not cheap. I don't know what the exact thing, you'd obviously have to talk to your account rep, but it is certainly a product at the moment that does require fairly expensive licensing. However, that is coming down. My understanding is that Microsoft is so keen on this particular technology that they will make it more available. But what we're also seeing is a lot of this, the ideas behind this, is that there's privileged access management in Azure that works in a very similar way. So Microsoft's very aware that they have certain on-premises customers who are never going to go to the cloud. And they need an on-prem solution that this is going to work with. And this is the on-prem solution. There is a cloud version of this where literally if you want to spin up a new VM, you've got to go and request something and then go and sign into your phone to get authorization to go and do it. So let me just spin up the second machine that will be part of the next demo, and then I will talk about the next part. Yes, so certain aspects of MIM do get included with EMS, but one of the things that you learn very quickly when you are doing Microsoft conferences is that you give very inspecific answers when anybody asks a licensing question. Because if you give an answer that sounds definitive, you get salespeople chasing you and trying to kill you. So I'm not entirely sure of the answer to that question. Okay. Yeah, so we've just done that. Okay. So you can even go further. You can, as I said, require approval for elevation. You can even sync it in, and that does require a bit of Azure, where you sync it in, and then you can basically require two-factor authentication. So the idea literally is, let's say someone's got one of the really important accounts, and you want to be absolutely sure that that person who's requesting the elevation is the person who's requesting the elevation. It can ring their phone, and then they have to type a code into their phone to get elevation. So that's in your ultimate secure environment sort of a thing. Okay, so let's talk, that's the PAM guide, the Privileged Access Management Guide. So if you go to akka.ms/PAM, you will get all of the details and the specifics of what I've just shown you in the demo. So let's talk about just enough administration. Now, just enough administration doesn't cost you anything extra other than your time, which of course we know is insanely valuable because you're all very special people. Just enough administration works in the following way. What you do is you create what's called a task-specific PowerShell endpoint. So when you make a remote PowerShell connection, it connects to a thing called an endpoint. There's a default endpoint, and that allows you to do everything. So you make the connection, and then you've got access to all of the commandlets that are installed on that machine. What you can do with just enough administration is create a special endpoint, and this special endpoint only has specific commandlets available. Not only does it only have specific commandlets available, it only has certain parameters that can be used with that commandlet. For example, add DNS server resource record. And you might say record name, but you might block set DNS server resource record. Or you might say add DNS server resource record, type is A. So you allow them to create host records, but you don't allow them to go and create MX records or SRV records. You limit which PowerShell commandlets and parameters can be used, and you can limit them what they can be used against. So you might say, right, you can't use these values. So another example, restart service. You can say, I'm going to say restart service is allowed. I'm going to specify what the name parameter is, and the only service that this can be used against is the DNS server service. So if they tried to restart any other service, they can't, but they can use restart service against that service. You can also configure it to ensure all activity is logged. Now, as I've had a few people say to me, because I was talking about this a little bit in yesterday's session, they said, well, it's all PowerShell. Why would we want to in any way, I mean, we know that we've got to get into PowerShell, but this seems very difficult. You can then go and build a GUI around this and then basically hand the GUI to the person that needs to do that task. So this is built with the idea. One of the other things that Microsoft's doing is they're saying, instead of us giving you administrative tools that are limited to what we've got you to do in Active Directory users and computers or the DNS console, what we're going to do now is we're going to give you the tools to build the tools that you will use that will meet your very specific needs. And this is a very different approach. So for very small organisations, the traditional tools are going to work. But if you're a larger organisation where you really want to lock down what people can do, you could go and create the just enough administration bit, and then you go and create a tool that is basically a GUI front end to PowerShell that goes and does this. Just like we saw with the old Exchange console in, say, Exchange Server 2010, which basically would go and build PowerShell commandlets for you. So you configure the endpoint so that only members of specific groups can connect. So this is how you authenticate it. Is you say, right, if you're a member of the DNS ops group, you can connect to this endpoint. If you are not a member of the DNS ops group, you cannot connect to this endpoint. And because you're all really smart and you've just seen me demonstrate just-in-time administration, where you're controlling the membership of a group on a time-based contingent basis, you can see how you can glue these two together, right? You've got a PowerShell endpoint that you've got to be a member of a specific group to connect to. And then you've got this other technology that allows you to add people to a group for a certain amount of time. This is how you marry the two of them together. Now, the other really cool thing is that when you connect to the endpoint, so you connect to the endpoint, it goes and checks whether or not you've got the appropriate Kerberos ticket for it. It doesn't actually log you onto the machine. What it does is it creates a special virtual account that has administrative privileges on that machine. But it has administrative privileges only for the commands that you've said it can use. It can't do anything else except for the commands that you said it could use, but when it's running those, it's running them as an admin, which is what you want to do, because you're locking it right down and you're saying, okay, you can use this, this, and this, but of course I'm going to, if you need to go and create a new DNS zone, if you need to go and create a new user, you're allowed to do that because I've only allowed you to go and do that. But the advantage of using a virtual account means that no credentials are being left on the machine. So in theory, remember our assume breach, our assume compromise mentality. If someone has hacked into that machine and is capturing credentials, they're not going to get anything because it's a virtual account that's only created for the moment that that endpoint is active, and the moment it becomes inactive, the account goes poof, and it doesn't exist anymore. So there are no credentials. They can't come back and go, wow, I've captured the domain admin credentials, or I've captured the DNS administrator credentials, because there are no DNS administrator credentials stored on the local machine. It requires PowerShell 5 or WMF 5 or higher. It requires at least Windows Server 2012 R2, and of course is supported out of the box on Windows Server 2016. But it doesn't cost you anything other than to set it up. It's not like Microsoft Identity Manager, and this is one of these things that you can start to implement now. To build it, the trick on building it and the trick about thinking about it is you need to know which PowerShell commandlets, functions, and aliases. So sometimes a commandlet is a commandlet, sometimes a commandlet's actually a function, and basically all you do is you do a get command and you figure out which it is. You work out what tools someone needs to perform their task. Now, one of the cool things is that there's all of these things in the PowerShell gallery where someone's gone, well, you know the role of a DNS administrator? These are all of the commandlets that they probably need. You take that template, you modify it for your environment, and you're golden. So what you do is you store this information in a variable as a container role capability. So you can see in this one, it's saying, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to import these modules. We're going to allow them to use CD and dir, change directory and directory. And in this case, and this is back when I wrote this one slide, when actually you used PowerShell to manage containers. We've actually switched now that we're using Docker, but in the future you'll have both Docker and PowerShell to do it. So as written, this one wouldn't work. But it was saying, okay, I'm going to allow this person to use set container, start container, stop container, new container, remove container, import container image, all of these functionality around this, because the idea of this GA endpoint was that it was for someone who was only able to go onto that server to manage containers. That's all they could do. They couldn't touch anything else on the server, but when it came to containers, they had the power of Voltron. To access the roles, you specify that it's a restricted remote server, that it can only be used remotely, and they're restricted to the commandlets that you've said. And in the role definitions file, it said for the container admins group, the role capabilities are the containers role capability, which I just defined in the previous slide, which was all of that. You can do anything with containers, but other than that, sorry. You could also have a role called services, and that might be that they can go and manage services on the service. They can go and restart services, but you might stop them from modifying the properties of a service. So, in terms of building it, you go and add it to modules, and what it does is it creates a PowerShell module. Now, you can then use it with desired state configuration to deploy it across your organisation, so that you can automatically have your servers automatically import all of these things and set up these endpoints. So you can set it up on one, and then you can create a DSC pull server that will allow you to distribute all of this information throughout all of the servers in your organisation as necessary. Or you can go and manually just import these PowerShell modules as necessary. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you locking down a Windows role. So here I am. I'm going on to LUN-DC1. I'm signing on as administrator. Now what I'll do, as I'll wait for that to disappear, is I will start PowerShell ISE. Because there's going to be bits and pieces that I need to modify. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change to the PowerShell modules folder. Once I'm in the PowerShell module folder, I'll create a folder called DNSOps. I'll change into DNSOps, and then I'll say create a new module manifest called DNSOps.psd1. Okay, that failed. Let me just go and... Okay, so what I'll do is, it was make the role capabilities, CD role capabilities, new PS role capability file minus path dot DNSOps.psrc, and then ISE DNSOps.psrc. And when I do that, it opens the PowerShell role capability file automatically in ISE, and now I can make some modifications to that. So what I want to do is I want to go in to the visible commandlets. So I want to basically control which commandlets can actually be used. So I go to visible commandlets here, and under visible commandlets, what I want to do is I want to specify which commandlets can be used. So I say visible commandlets equals at name, and this will be restart service. The parameter will be the name of the service, and the validate set will be DNS. So what that means is I'm going to allow you to use restart service for this service name only if the service is called the DNS service. The next thing I do is I go to visible functions. Now, most of the commandlets that I'm interested in the DNS server module are actually functions rather than commandlets. So what I'm going to do here is I am going to add the add DNS server resource record, which allows me to add a resource record to DNS. The clear DNS server cache, which will clear the DNS server's cache. The get DNS server resource record, which will allow me to see all of the DNS server resource records. Remove an existing DNS server resource record. And I'm not going to go and lock those down by which parameters. I'm going to allow those commandlets or those functions to be used in their entirety. The next thing I do is I'm going to go down to visible external commands, and this is where I specify which command line utilities can actually be used. So in this case, I want to use whoami, and the reason I want to put whoami in there is I want to demonstrate a little later that this is actually going to use a virtual account rather than that I'm the account that I've made the connection with. So I go and I save that. So that is our role capability file. The next thing I need to do is go and create a session configuration file. So I'll just clear that up. And then what I do is I create a new PowerShell session configuration file. The path will be local and it'll be called dnsops.pssc for PowerShell session configuration, and then I'm going to open that in PowerShell ISE. So that's opened that file up in PowerShell ISE. So what I need to do here is I need to go down here and put the session type to default, which it is, and I go to the change it from session type to default to session type restricted remote server. Then what I need to do is I need to specify that the run as virtual account will be true. So when I do this, it will use a virtual account rather than the account I'm using to connect to that session endpoint. And then under role definitions, what I do is I specify which group I'm going to limit this to. So in this case, I say role definitions, and what I've done is I've got a local group called adatum DNS ops. And I've got a user account called Beth, who is a member of the DNS ops group. So I save that. And what that'll do is it's basically specified the parameters of the session configuration. So what I do now is I come back down here, I clear that, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to register that session. So register PS session configuration, specify the name as DNS ops, the path dnsops.pssc. Now it gives me a warning, and it says what you need to do, and that's not going to work because it didn't restart the service. So what I'll do here is I'll just go restart service, WinRM. I'll restart the WinRM service, and then if I do a get PS session configuration and then run that, what I will see when I scroll back up is that the DNS ops PowerShell session configuration file has been created and applied as an endpoint to this server, which is DC1. These things work fine if you get the timing exactly right, but sometimes your server sits there and goes, I'm going to wait a second before I type that command, or I'm going to type it a second earlier, and then you get a whole lot of mess. That's why I only do about 3 lines per automation. Okay, so what I do is I jump across to LUN server 1. I sign on here. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what it looks like without the role configuration. So I sign on as a bog standard administrator. It's going, your Windows license will expire soon, but I still have 20 days, which is all I need to do this demo. I open up PowerShell, and I will make this a little bigger for you. Okay, so we're logged on. What I will do here is I'm creating a remote session from LUN server 1 through to DC1. So enter peer session, computer name, LUN DC1. I've made that a remote session. Get command count says that there's 2,259 commandlets that are available to an administrator on this box, if they're not using PowerShell Just Enough Administrator. And then by doing the who am I have verified that I am logged on as the default domain administrator account there. So that's showing you what it looks like without that. So I do an exit PS session, and then I exit this, and then I sign off. So what I'm now going to do is I am going to sign on as a user named Beth. Now, as I said, Beth is a member of the DNS Ops group, which means that Beth has permission to go and connect to that GIA endpoint. So what I'll do is I'll go up and I'll create PowerShell again. I'll just make it so that it's big so that everybody can see. Okay, so the first thing we do is we enter PS session, so we're establishing a remote PowerShell session to the computer, DC1. The configuration endpoint name is going to be DNS Ops, so that's the one we created. So we've connected to that, we run get command, and what we see is that Beth has access to only 13 commandlets when she's connected, not the 2,259 that were there before. And when we do a who am I, we see that she's running as the virtual user /winrm va_1_ a datum Beth account. So none of Beth's credentials are present on this machine. She authenticated against the endpoint. Her credentials were ignored by then. She was allowed to pass through. If anybody's credential scraping this using Mimikatz, it's not going to work. So if I did a get command, we can see which commands she has access to. I can then do a get DNS server resource get DNS server resource record minus zone name adatum.com. And what this does is it shows that Beth can view every resource record that's in the adatum.com zone, which is very good, because what we're going to do now is we're going to verify that she can actually add a DNS server resource record. So I go add DNS server resource record minus zone name adatum.com minus a, so it's a host record, minus name ignite SDR1 for, oops, and then what we'll do is we'll give it the IPv4 address, 172.16.0.111. Hit enter. Okay, so let's go back and verify that that got created. And what we can see is just above LUN CL1 is we've got Ignite SVR1. So she's actually able to go and create those resource records. Now, what she can also do is restart the DNS service. But if she tries to restart anything else, say WinRM, we get an error. Why? Because she's not allowed to do that, because we've locked it down. So that, at a very high level, is a demonstration of how to build and test Just Enough Administration working on Windows Server 2016. Okay, so just to sort of wrap it up, you need to configure, one of the ways that you can go further than this is you could use jump servers and basically configure your server so that people had to log on to a particular jump server. The jump server's got a very locked down configuration. You can also configure what's called Privileged Access Workstation. Privileged Access Workstation is where you configure a workstation that basically doesn't allow web browsing that is got Credential Guard and Device Guard put on it, and you can only perform administrative tasks from a privileged access workstation. So the idea is everybody in the IT department has a computer that they use for their day-to-day reading of email and all of that, and then they've got a computer that they just use for administration. And that's Microsoft's recommendation. If you're in a highly secure environment, you have a separate computer that you do not go and faff around looking at Reddit or Stack Overflow or server fault on, because anything that you're browsing the internet on has got a much higher chance of getting infected than something that doesn't. Lockdown who is able to sign on to these privileged access workstations, and lockdown who can actually go and configure GIA endpoints. Then what you do is you basically disable non-GIA connections to these servers. So instead of having that default connection, which I showed you how to do, what you do is you actually lock it down and you say, no, I'm sorry, you can only come in through a GIA endpoint. You turn off things like remote desktop as well. So you go as far as you can in terms of locking these things down. You can deploy it using DSC or scripting, and it's a better option as you are likely to have, DSC is a better option as you're simply likely to have a bunch of servers that you want to go and configure this on. You can see this works with DNS. You've got all your DNS servers, go and configure it so that they can only be managed in this way. DNS is an important service because we know that one of the ways that people attack people is they do credential reset. And they do credential reset where they know what your mail domain is, and then they redirect your MX records to point to their mail server, and then they just go and intercept the password reset email that gets sent to them. Okay, you can combine it with privileged access management, as I was talking about. Basically, a user goes, Beth goes and says, I want to go and do something on the DNS server. She's then added to that DNS ops group for 60 minutes. She goes and performs her function. She's removed from DNS ops. She can no longer connect to the endpoint until she has actually gone and requested that again. You have to know what tools people use to perform tasks. You can go and use those templates, but the templates are not going to make sense unless you have an understanding of the PowerShell underneath it. It's not that complex, you've just got to sit down and study it. Most administrators do pull tools out of the box as they need them and will be reluctant to administer a locked down toolbox. You do need a cultural change to start using this, because at the moment a lot of us sort of sit there and go, oh, that didn't work, okay, let's try that tool. Let's try that tool. And in certain cases, you're going to have to allow that sort of activity to occur. So you might create a special endpoint that someone can connect to that allows them to do everything. But you log that, you basically require them to authenticate. You get authentication for that as well. Okay. Warning, it requires your administration team to use PowerShell. GIA does not support anything other than PowerShell, and as I said, you can build GUI tools. Remember that complexity is the enemy of correct security configuration, and configuring some of this is going to be challenging. Configuring GIA is challenging at the start, but you will get the hang of it. Getting both of them to work together is very challenging, but it's also going to make your environment a lot more secure. Security is inconvenient. You can configure Microsoft Identity Manager to use two-factor authentication, and remember that just-in-time administration is easier to implement than GIA, simply because with GIA you've got to know which commandlets people are going to use. Security needs to be commensurate with value of assets protected, so the amount of effort that you're putting into this needs to be commensurate with your organisation. If you're literally running something that's not worth a lot of money, you don't put a you don't buy a $10,000 safe to protect a $1,000 diamond. So keep that in mind. Okay, anybody got any questions? Question? Azure PowerShell is adopting parts of it, and in the long run it will, because basically Azure is built on top of Windows Server. But at the moment, not as much as you can do it on Windows Server. But yes, eventually you will be able to do it, because they've already got privileged access management in Azure. Any other questions? Yep. Well, I don't work for Microsoft, so, but I wrote those labs, and those labs are actually the ones, I wrote the course that those labs are used in for Microsoft Learning, and the demonstration I just did there is basically the demonstration that if you actually go to a CPLS and you're learning that technology, that's the demonstration I created for them. So there's a lot of people using that lab, but again, there's more people that are starting to use it. But if you go and ask Jeffrey Snover on Twitter, Which clients are using Gia? I think he might actually come back. I think that there's some military clients in the US and some banks and things like that.
So on the PowerShell command where at the end they put the role that you want to log in at, if they leave that out, they get every side effect?
So what would happen is if you've left the default endpoint open, yes, they would, and they've got permission to connect to that. So that's why you have to go and turn off that default endpoint. Now, normally you need a certain level of privilege to connect to that default endpoint. You've basically got to be a member of the local administrators group, right? On a server. So it's probably not going to allow you to log on, but yeah, what you do is you turn that off. Okay. Anybody else got any questions? Yep, up the back. Yep. Okay, so what you do is there's actually a thing called admin free Active Directory, which is that you even get to the point where you basically turn that account off. Then you have to have a way of breaking the glass, and it is possible that you might have to come up with a rollback situation where you do that. Okay, anybody else? Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. Remember to fill out an evaluation. Thank you.